Hey everyone, Professor Leis here. In this video I want to talk about synthesizing our sources and avoiding what we call the listing effect. So synthesis is it's a key concept that we need to begin to learn how to do in our writing because it will help us form more sophisticated ideas and approach writing in a more sophisticated, nuanced way. So let me go ahead and read through this and I'll explain it as we go. One of the limiting carryovers from the 5-paragraph essay structure is the tendency to treat the main points of an essay as separate, distinct, and often disconnected items in a list. Point A, point B, and point Z. Treating points as disconnected items in a list creates what I call the listing effect. An effective and sophisticated essay, however, will treat its points as connected links in a chain of meaning, a unified progression of ideas that helps develop the essay's focus. One of the markers of critical thinking is to be able to forge connections among seemingly disconnected ideas to generate insight or add to an idea's complexity. In a research-based essay, it is important that we put our sources into conversation with one another. Conversations are productive exchanges of ideas. As writers, we must orchestrate the exchange of ideas among our sources. We call this synthesis. To synthesize, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, means to put together or combine into a complex whole, to make up by a combination of parts or elements. Ultimately, it is through synthesis that ideas are born and expanded. So here is a list of ways that we can practice these concepts and incorporate this into our writing. So I want you all to strive to try to do this in your writing. So let's go ahead and break this down. Introduce your sources to your reader when you quote from them. So we have that document integrating quotation, so it's a really good idea to take a look at that document. But we want to make sure that every time we introduce or bring in a new source that we're providing some sort of introduction for our readers. So the two most basic things is we need to indicate the author of the source and the title of the source. But oftentimes it's also a good idea to provide a little bit of context about maybe who the person is, maybe just a brief explanation of who they might be, or a brief explanation of what their source might be focused on. So just in a sentence or two, but provide some sort of introduction to a source every first time you bring that source into your writing. You don't need to introduce it every single time. Obviously, you would indicate who the author is, but the very first time you bring a source into your writing, make sure you provide some kind of introduction to it. Try to have more than one quotation from each of your sources. While there isn't a specific number of quotations you should have altogether, you want to make sure you're making adequate use of each source. So there isn't a set number of quotations you need in your essay overall, but I want you to strive to have more than one quotation from each of your sources. And in many cases, you should have a good handful of quotations from your sources, especially if there's some sources that you're relying on more than others. Make sure that you are working with them adequately and you're not just only having one quotation from each of your sources. So we should have more than one quotation from each of our sources, many of which you'll have definitely well over 2 quotations for each of the sources. Have quotations from at least 3 sources on each of the middle pages of your essay. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but it is something to strive for. So in the body of your essay, meaning the middle pages of your essay, so by the time you submit your polished draft, it will be at least 8 full pages. So in the middle pages of your essay, try to have at least one appearance from 3 different sources on each page. So you shouldn't have any pages where you don't bring in any sources or pages where you're only focused on one source. Try to have appearances from at least 3 different sources on the middle pages of your essay. Of course, they don't need to be the same 3 sources. Obviously, you want to have a nice balance overall, but Make sure that you have sources appearing, multiple sources appearing on each middle page of your essay. As often as possible, include more than one quotation in each of your body paragraphs, especially if each quotation comes from a different source. How does one quotation from one source connect or relate to a quotation from another source? What's the relationship between the two sources of quotations? How do you synthesize these ideas to form a new idea? So this is something to strive for. As often as you can, try to incorporate more than one source surrounding a single point. So how does source A speak to source D, for example? How do they connect to the same point you're exploring in a single paragraph? Show that to your readers. That's a way where you're gonna point out that or you're gonna begin to synthesize those ideas because you're connecting those different things together. Think of your essay as a movie and the different sources you've included as characters in this movie. Ensure that the majority of your sources have recurring roles throughout your essay. Avoid including each source in its own separate section of the essay. How can a source you include near the beginning of your essay make another appearance later in your essay? Just as characters do in movies, some sources can have leading roles in your essay while a handful may have minor roles. The key is to make sure you're blending your sources throughout your essay rather than keeping each source separate and distinct. So I think this can be a helpful analogy when you envision your essay as a movie. Just as in a movie, the characters or your sources should have recurring roles throughout. You don't have an appearance from one source at the very beginning of your essay and never mention them again. And definitely avoid organizing your essay based on your sources. Don't just say, I'm going to talk all about source A, and then move on. Say, I'm going to talk all about source B, and then move on. I'm going to talk all about source C on down the line, and don't show the connections among those. Organize your essay around ideas and not the sources you're using. So how do the different sources connect to ideas? But think of your sources as characters in a movie. You might have 5 of your 8 sources have more prominent roles than the other 3, or whatever the case might be, and so you can have more material from those sources than some of the others. But you want to make sure that your sources are appearing throughout your essay and not just relinquished to their own separate, distinct areas in the essay. That will help. That will create that listing effect that we're trying to avoid. Make sure that you have organized your points in a logical order. What does the reader need to know first before another idea will make sense to them? So in other words, make sure that you're showing how one idea leads into the next, but you're also providing information to your readers in a way where you can add to them so it makes sense to your readers. What do your readers need to know at the outset in order for the rest of the material to make sense to them? Explain the relationship between ideas. How does one idea relate to the idea that comes before it and the ones that come after? How does the point fit into the larger context of your essay? Explaining the significance of a point and how it fits together with the rest of your essay can help develop the relationship. So this is really important to think about, pointing out the relationship among your sources. How does one idea from one source relate to another idea from another source? Explain that to your readers. Point those connections out, because your readers may not necessarily see those connections right away, and so it's your job to point that out to your readers. And then finally, think of transitions less as words or phrases and more like bridges between ideas. What is the relationship between these ideas? What detail can you use from one paragraph that will help you connect it to the paragraph that follows? So a lot of times we tend to think of transitions as just simple words or phrases. Furthermore, in addition, like that. But I'm encouraging you to think of transitions as more like bridges between things. So what idea do you explore in one paragraph that will help you lead into the idea that follows in the next paragraph? So one way to think about it, there's a sentence construction you can use. Not only this, but that. right? So not only this that we talked about in the preceding paragraph, but this new thing that we're going to talk about in this next paragraph. That's a way to think about it. So that's kind of building the bridge between the ideas. Show the connection among things. So that's really one of the key takeaways. All right, so as I mentioned, these are things that I want you to strive for in the composition of your essays. Do all within your power to try to incorporate these concepts into your writing, because it will ultimately make for a more sophisticated, more successful, effective essay. All right, if you have any questions, please let me know.